So let's get right into it. Welcome and thank you for being here. Abdi, set the stage for us this evening. It's 2016. We're many decades from 1965. Why are we still talking about voting rights, and what are the major issues from your perspective?
Let me begin by thanking JCRC for inviting us all and for hosting this series of conversations. Does this sound okay? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I really want to thank JCRC for taking the time to do this and creating the space to really think through these questions related to racial justice. I've spent the last year actually reading quite a bit about our country's history, democracy, and the place of voting in that story. And I will just say I expect we'll be talking about voting rights forever. There's never been a time in this country's history where the question of who has the vote, who has the ability to be represented inside the circle of democracy has not been contested. There have been periods in which that issue was very stark, far to the other side, and that is at the founding of this country. Categorically, African Americans, women, and most even white men without property did not have the right to vote. The Constitution of the United States itself, at our founding, did not say very much about voting. That was left to state legislatures and state constitutions, most of which had those barriers. And over the period of the era with slavery, leading up through the Civil War, the electorate was actually quite small. In the period of Jacksonian democracy preceding the Civil War, when this country had its goal of manifest destiny and settling the West, voting was actually very loose and very open, including to non-citizens. So white men who were settling the West, even without formal citizenship, had the right to vote because the country was trying to secure the West, obviously from the Native American populations that lived there. Coming out of the Civil War, we have the three major constitutional amendments. The 13th, which ended slavery, the 14th, which provided equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which secured the right to vote at that time only for African American men. And then later, through the suffrage movement, we secured the right to vote for women. And then further, later, a constitutional amendment eliminated the right to vote. They eliminated property requirements for voting. In the baby boomers generation, we got the voting age reduced through constitutional amendment to the age of 18. So this is part of the story of this country, is the expansion of the franchise coming up and through this history. But the history is not just in one direction. So after the 15th Amendment secured the right to vote for African American men, and you had the Reconstruction government and the presence of the federal government, there's a real surge of African American representation in the states in the South. And that all came to an end with the end of Reconstruction. That came to an end with Jim Crow and the Age of Terror. Such that by the time we come to 1960, 1962, 3, 4, and leading up to the Civil Rights Act, the number of African American citizens who were registered to vote in most southern states was exceedingly low. And the number who would cast a vote and the level of representation was next to zero. And it was the Civil Rights Movement, it was the Mississippi Freedom Summer, it was the March to Selma, it was the mobilization in the black community and the allies that came to support the black community, as well as strong political leadership ultimately that got us the Voting Rights Act. My point being that right now we're in a period of retrenchment, not unlike what followed the end of Reconstruction. The scale and the magnitude of that retrenchment now is not yet as grave as what we saw after the end of Reconstruction, but we are in a period where things are going in reverse, and it takes all of our vigilance to turn that back around again and gain again the momentum of protecting and expanding the right to vote. So that's a very long answer, but my point basically is that in a big picture sense, the story of this country is the expansion of the right to vote, But that story is not just one that goes in one direction. There are periods in which those rights are taken away, and we have to fight to secure them once again.
Thank you. Mindy, what would you like to add to that? Can you
Well,
also-
so Mike,
What would you like to add to that? And can you tell us from your perspective, what else we need to think about in terms of voting patterns, obstacles, issues that that play into the voting patterns of communities of color and other marginalized communities?
Sure. Well, first off, I wouldn't add anything to your summary because that was quite thorough and a very hard thing to do. Really, in a matter of a few minutes, all of our history when it comes to access to the vote. What I would add is to say, thinking of now who are the groups that are allowed right to vote and have been added to the franchise. Does that mean, even taking aside for a moment the retrenchment and people trying to make it harder to vote, as it stands now, does it mean that everybody has equal access, right? The way the laws are and actually the way people actually behave politically. And that's not the case. So we have really our story since folks have been franchised, if you will, has been one of disparities. There's always been significant differences in terms of turnout by race, by age, by income, pretty much you name it. And in our current time, what we see is those of color, young people, folks that are lower income, from lower educational backgrounds. Those are all underrepresented groups, and I could name many, many more, right? But underrepresented groups, meaning that because they have lower turnout rates than whites, and usually by the way, in case you're curious, the group that has the highest turnout rates in any given election is above 65 white. And women are actually have a little higher turnout rates than men, if you didn't know that. But so basically everybody else just about is underrepresented. The question is to how much, meaning they have lower turnout rates, and so they make up a smaller pie or share of the pie of voters in any given election. What we always look at is, does their share of the vote, right, all actual voters, how does that look like compared to their share of the population, or the eligible voter population at least? And if you have lower turnout rates, then you're going to be there's going to be a gap, and you're going to be underrepresented, right? And those right now that are most underrepresented in our country are young people and folks of color. African Americans a little bit less so, and we can talk about why that's the case, but they are underrepresented. Depends on what election you're looking at, type of election. But in California, Latinos and Asian Americans are very underrepresented. They're consistently underrepresented across elections, whether you're talking about presidential or midterm, local elections. The question always is, we know there's going to be a gap. We know they're going to be underrepresented. How big is that gap, right? And typically, the lower turnout elections, even though everybody's voting lower, the gap, the disparity is wider. When we hear of high turnout elections or general elections, general presidential elections is as good as we get typically, the gap is usually a little bit lower because groups that are less likely to vote tend to be more likely to vote in presidential years. Make sense? Okay, so there's always a story of disparity. The question is just how big. The other thing that I would, and we can talk more about that, but maybe put some numbers around it. In 2014, we had a record low turnout rate here in California, if you haven't heard, right? Our eligible turnout rate was only 31% for the general November 2014 election. Now, that was not a presidential year, but it was a midterm. We had a governor's race. Some people argue that we didn't, but we had a governor's race, if you remember the candidate on the other side of it. But for lots of different reasons, which if anybody's curious, we can get into, but we had a record low turnout. But if you break out the electorate by race and ethnicity, you will see that a huge difference between whites to Asian Americans and African Americans and Latinos. And in any given election, usually 15 to 20 percentage points, excuse me, I have a slide that likes me, 15 to 20 percentage points typically between whites and Latinos and Asian Americans, for instance. Young people, I'm going to ask you, what do you think that turnout rate was for those aged 18 to 24 who are eligible to vote? So the percentage of those eligible to vote in that age group, whether they were registered or not.
In the November 24th?
Yeah. What do you think? We've done research on this. We've released 15%? 10? 8.2%. Every time I give that number, every time I get gasps, yeah. So everybody was low, but if you actually calculate the numbers, you'll see that young people were even more underrepresented vis-a-vis older groups. And those that were over 55, their turnout rates were in the 40s. Over 65 in the 50s, almost 60%. Still, I would argue, too low. Huge difference, right? And there's consequences for this. So why does any of this matter? Why does voting matter? Why does it matter if folks don't have access? If there's voter suppression or vote dilution, two topics that we usually think about when we think about voting rights. Turnout's a big part of the voting rights story because vote dilution and voter suppression is about, right, also about turnout. Why does any of this matter? Because voting is power. You don't suppress something or make it harder for people to vote if it doesn't have any impacts, right? There's reasons for it. And when there's disparities in turnout and groups are underrepresented, then that means there's real consequences in terms of not only having a voice in policy, but also in outcomes in policy, right? That should be obvious, but so politicians and campaigns and candidates, they know who vote, they know who don't vote. And so there's that tangible, right, reality, and that's why young people, you don't hear much about their policies, right? You don't hear much about them in any given campaign. Maybe a little bit at the presidential level, because Bernie Sanders talked to young people pretty aggressively. But any other type of election, we usually don't see much, right? And I could name off the group. So that's, I think, how I'll frame it.
Great. So to enable us to set the scene a little bit, I'd like to take us back to 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. And for both of you, we'd like to know a little bit about what about the Voting Rights Act? What vehicles in there, what changes in there, what redirections in there actually enabled for the enfranchisement of a number of voters, and how did that enfranchisement really impact communities of color and marginalized communities in terms of their voting and the outcome? Do you want to do the technical aspect?
I'll try, sure. So, I will say in the introduction, Mindy was introduced as an expert on voting and the trends by which people vote, and she is a genuine expert. If you wanted the actual expert on voting rights from ACLU, it would be like several people in line ahead of me. So I'm more of a generalist, but I can tell you kind of some of the themes. So I can say the 1965 Voting Rights Act was significant for a number of reasons. Among them, it specifically prohibits discrimination based on race in the rules for voting, who can register, and the other rules around elections. But it had some teeth to enforce that. And the most important element is that in those jurisdictions that were found to have a record of racially discriminatory barriers to voting, if a government wanted to change the rules of voting, it would have to be pre-cleared by either the U.S. Department of Justice or the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia. And so they would have to show that this change is not going to be discriminatory. And so that puts a lot of rigor on a local jurisdiction that wants to make that change because they have to run it by the Justice Department. What's significant about this law is that once it became the law, it has been renewed on a bipartisan basis by both houses of the legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and signed back into law multiple times by Democratic and Republican presidents. And it's a law that's been very effective, to the point that when the Shelby challenge came and this case went to the United States Supreme Court, the court almost took the effectiveness of the law as a reason for why the law is no longer needed. And it's a very kind of, in my view, cynical way of looking at it, because now as soon as the law was taken away, literally within days, these states began again to enact voter suppression laws, which we'll talk about more later. But the Voting Rights Act is not the only law that protects the right to vote. It's not the only law that aims to modernize or improve elections. There are many other laws, federal and state, that are available to us as are other provisions of the Voting Rights Act.
I think just what I would add there specific to the change now. The flag. So with the Shelby case, and please correct me if I've got anything, but with the Shelby case, my understanding is now that essentially Section 5 is gutted. Those states, because we had entire states, and those counties within states, and we had 3 counties as of 2013 that were under pre-clearance in California, if you didn't know. So Yuba, Monterey, and Kings County, and changed over the years. So California is definitely part of this. So essentially, anything going forward, right? We used to have pre-clearance. If there's a change, okay, we know basically that you have a history that's suspect, or very well proven, but we still suspect there could be issues going forward. If you want to make a change, you have to have it pre-cleared. But now, that doesn't have to happen, right? And immediately, we saw states moving to make changes. So I think within hours, Texas enacted or at least started the process to enact its voter ID laws. North Carolina, which of course just recently had a court case, decided positively, but was moving to also enact voter ID laws, something that had been not open to them previously. And so so states knew, that people knew what this meant, and people were acting on it. And to be able to make a change, you have to go to court now, right? Which is costly, time-consuming, and even if you win in the interim, you've got damage that is done, right? And confusion that could be lasting. If you're a voter and your vote is suppressed in some way, you get turned away, you get discouraged from voting, you may never come back, even with the change, right? Or with the law being change being struck down. So I think I would add that, and then just to, I'm sure we will talk about it more later, but think about California still being very much a part of this discussion. And I think oftentimes California isn't a part of that discussion, or people think that, well, we don't have it in our state, right? Or this is largely about African Americans, right? Or it's about this type of group or this type of issue. It's not the case at all. And so California, one topic that comes up very often in California is access to language, right? Language access ballots in your own language, the training, the provision of ballots, but also the training around polling place workers and general access issues. Comes up a lot because in our state we have a large population that is limited English proficient. So it's another aspect of thinking about voting rights. Language access is a key part, particularly for us here in California.
Let's go ahead and continue the conversation about California a little bit, and then we'll talk about restricted voting laws. But tell us a little bit more about, from your perspective, how do you think California compares in terms of in other states? How does it practice some of these voting rights restrictions or not? And what are some of the impacts?
Okay, me? Okay. Well, let me start a little more broadly, if I may. So when we talk about opening up access, in recent years, California has actually been, compared to other states, many other states, more progressive. And then we'll talk about violations and so forth. But we have a number of election reforms, if you hadn't heard about them. Same-day voter registration, which hasn't been enacted yet. Automatic voter registration, you probably heard about, which also has not been enacted yet, and it is somewhat limited. It's really what we're calling automated voter registration. 16-year-olds soon will be able to, once it's implemented, be able to pre-register to vote at the DMV. We're talking about vote centers in California. There are research that we just recently released at the CCEP at UC Davis shows some concerns about vote centers, but it's a major reform. And so there's a dialogue in the state now, particularly in the last few years, particularly after 2014 and that record low turnout rate, where a number of members of the state legislature, and now we have a new secretary of the state, that's been having a lot of conversation and taking a lot of action around trying to open up. And every election, online voter registration was implemented 4 years ago, and that idea was to make it easier and to open up registration to lots of folks, a lot more folks. Not everything does what it's supposed to do or says it's supposed to do, and so just because it's labeled as electoral reform doesn't mean that the problem's solved, and we need to track and we need to monitor, which I'm happy to talk about more about that. But we have been at least talking about these, and as we discuss those reforms that I just mentioned to you and others, the first thing you hear is Why should we do this? It's because we want to increase turnout and increase access. Not everybody is on the train for that reason. A lot of people are on the train on a given reform because they think it's gonna, it'll be more cost-effective, things like that. But that's usually still the public narrative. And so we have that narrative, that's great. We're not instituting voter ID laws, for instance, right? So put that context. And a lot of states are looking to us after automatic voter registration and after some of our other electoral reforms, because we're the biggest state in the nation. We also set an example, good or bad, for other states, right, and for reforms, and particularly around automatic voter registration. People are looking to see what's going to happen here in California. So that being said, there are voting rights violations, and I want to let you speak to that as well, but there are voting rights violations, and the National Commission on Voting Rights, if you're interested in this topic, I really recommend you going to their website. In 2014, they traveled the nation because of the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and what happened with Shelby, but created a national report, and actually even though they went to many, many states across the nation, they came here to California, they created only one state report, and it was California. And so it details voting rights issues here in our state. And so, as I mentioned before, a lot of them are around the language access. We've seen that, we were just talking earlier about literal, I think what many people think about as like aggressive voter suppression up in Siskiyou County, if you want to talk about that too, Hmong population being heavily discouraged by what we understand is a local sheriff department. Huh?
Speak slow.
Oh, okay, sorry, thank you. So we do have instances of violations. At the same time, we have a statewide Voting Rights Act, which many are concerned does not have the teeth, certainly, that the National Voting Rights Act has, but with the elimination of pre-clearance, some of those protections, we do have something to fall back on. So I think I'll leave that there. Again, we have issues, we need to be vigilant, but at the same time, we do have a positive, forward-looking conversation that is very different than many other states. What would you add to
I'm going to
that?
add anything to that, and we'll talk about specific kinds of suppression.
Yeah, so just one of the long-term projects we've been involved in has been the question of who has the right to vote in our state. So our state constitution makes very clear that among citizens, only those who are in prison or on parole can be prohibited from voting. So in prison means, in our view, state prison, and parole is the extension when you leave state prison. But over the last decade, there have been a number of changes to the criminal justice system, so there are people who would have previously been sent to state prison who are now being sent to county jail. This is the governor's criminal justice realignment. So some of our public officials wanted to count those people among the category of people who would be denied the right to vote. And we brought litigation that looks directly at the language of the state constitution, in prison or on parole. And being in county jail is not the same as being in prison. Being on probation is not the same as being on parole. And we're talking about tens of thousands of people who are affected by these types of laws. So this took a great deal of work in stages, because these types of criminal justice reforms took time to take place. Now, meanwhile, we're working on the criminal justice side of this equation to reduce incarceration, but then that crosses over into our voting rights work, where we're dealing with it as it relates to the right to vote. So a project like this has taken a better part of a decade, and we now have a bill that's in front of the governor. We hope he will sign it, and that's a very tangible step for any of you as individuals. You can do is to call the governor and ask him to sign AB 2466. That's AB 2466, and that's by two wonderful legislators, Shirley Weber and Holly Mitchell. And what this does, we hope, for make it absolutely clear that it's just in prison and on parole where people have to give up their voting rights, and in all other instances, if you're a U.S. citizen, you would have the right to vote. In the reading that I was doing, I mentioned earlier, related to our country's history, one of the things that was just almost made me sick to my stomach was the way in which, I think it's the 14th Amendment, I may be wrong, it may be the 15th, but I think it's the 14th Amendment, said that after the Civil War, it denied the vote in the Constitution if you were involved in insurrection or other crime. And this was intended to say that if you were part of the Confederate Army that, fought against the United States, you're going to lose the right to vote. It's that very provision of the 14th Amendment, or 15th if I have it wrong, coming out of the Civil War that sought to provide equality that is now used as the justification to deny the right to vote to people in many states who are in prison or even lifetime bans on voting. So in a number of states like Florida and I believe Iowa, if you have a felony, even after you complete your sentence and you complete your parole, you're banned for life from voting. And when you look at the racial disparities of who is stopped by a police officer, the chances of being arrested, charged with a crime, convicted, and then sentenced to a felony, there's racial disparity at every one of those steps. So to me, it's one of the most gut-wrenching things that I came across as I did this research is the very amendment that was meant to uphold racial equality and racial justice is now a basis for denying the right to vote to tens of thousands, if not millions, of people, including large numbers of African Americans and other people of color. But the point just being that in California, we don't have a lifetime ban. Our ban on voting ends at parole, but we've had to fight to contain it at that line and to keep it from extending into the jails or people who are on probation or other people who are other forms of supervision.
Now, just add something too. Speaking of that fight, and I know the ACLU is, I think, the lead on this fight, but in 2011, when realignment happened, there was a question of, well, now that many of these folks are actually out of prison, right, and they're under local county supervision, they're out of prison, so would they be able to vote? And the then Secretary of State, Deborah Bowen, said no, they would not. It was about 61 something thousand people that this affected. And so she did not enfranchise them, basically. But then there was a lawsuit, and then I guess with new leadership with the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, that we have now, we've eventually gotten to those folks being enfranchised. So that's a case of a fight that was positive. The other thing I would end with a positive outcome, but I was going to add too, aside from what the law says or how it's implemented technically, there's a lot of misinformation out there. I saw heads in surprise about Florida. Did you know in California that it ends at parole, right? So if you're on probation or wasn't a felony, you can vote. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of folks that went to the criminal justice system, but even like sometimes county registrars, or staff, maybe new staff, we'll say, or folks that work with formerly incarcerated, right, populations. And so a lot of people just either assume they can't vote, because I'm a felon, I can't vote, or they get misinformation, or sometimes they even reach out and want to know, and they'll call, or a local office or whatever, and they'll get misinformation. And so then you get, which to me is even sadder in so many ways, that because somebody got it wrong, maybe even a well-intended person, but this is really widespread, the misunderstanding, that people get disenfranchised. So I just want to mention that. So as you go forward, that's one thing I always have to correct it, because there's so many assumptions around it.
Yeah, if I could share a little story about that point about misinformation. Each year we have an ACLU conference in Sacramento. We bring together several hundred people who want to work on civil rights, and at the end of the conference we go and lobby on several bills. And at one of these conferences we were having a meal, and I learned that one of the participants in the conference was a African-American woman. She was there with her daughter. She had a felony conviction on her record, and she was talking about how much she regrets the fact that she cannot vote. And I'm the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, and I said, well, you're not in prison now, correct? And she's sitting there. She said, no. I said, you've completed your parole, correct? She said, yes. I said, well, you can vote. And she wouldn't believe me. And I went and got the ACLU lawyer who has brought the sequence of cases on this. And I had the lawyer explain that in fact she could vote, and she still wouldn't believe our lawyer. There was another woman at the conference who had a similar life experience who we knew had registered to vote and knew that she could vote. We brought her, and we finally tipped this person over to the idea that in fact she could vote. And right there in front of 300 people, she registered to vote. But that took so much persuasion. I mean, we had a campaign. She was not going to leave that conference without knowing she had the ability to register. I can't force her to register to vote against her will. That would be a different civil liberties violation. But once these ideas are out there, and I think back to this, like Mindy was saying, is once the confusion is out there in the community, and there's the fear of being targeted, the fear of incarceration, the fear of breaking the law, it takes a lot of work to dispel that fear. And the confusion sets in, and it takes a lot of work of voter education, voter mobilization to break through the misinformation or the fear. And that's why the damage can often be done in the time a bill is even proposed, before a bill has even become law, even if you can get a judge to stop it because of that confusion.
I'll just add one quick thing, I promise. I was talking about misinformation, right? But we should say that there are folks that have preyed upon this. Cases across the country, and I think one here in California as well, but it's escaping me right now, where people will put up signs, right, and say, as a reminder, right, maybe even framed as a friendly help, you can't vote, right, if you're still on parole or something like that, or it's or something related to this, but it's a violation, right? You have to be able to make sure that you're eligible to vote, and it can be a trigger to people that, oh, well, I don't. Telling them that it's a crime to vote if they're not eligible, and it'll be a trigger that people read into it with their own, not uncertainties that I don't want to violate, I don't want to get in trouble, I'm not gonna register, or I'm not gonna vote. So the misinformation or the fear around that, or the hesitancy, people can actually prey upon that, and in not so subtle ways end up deterring people from voting.
I think we're all struck by, aside from the specific laws and strategies that you both have shared with us, or that create restricted voting and suppression, the impact of fear on the psyche of marginalized voters, and how that in itself is a tool for suppression. Before we move on from this particular topic, what do we need to know about voter ID laws? We hear a lot about them, and can you give us some insights on them, how they're used, and what we need to know to understand how they play into it?
Sure. So voter ID laws are one of several types of bills or statutes that have the effect of limiting the vote. And the auspices of voter ID law under which they're enacted, the kind of stated reason is to stop voter fraud. And the number of incidents of documented voter fraud are so incredibly few that to justify limiting access to voting over something that happens so infrequently is really beyond, like a legitimate government interest. When you put a barrier in front of a constitutionally protected right, you have to have a legitimate government interest. And so for a lot of people who are middle class or upper class, the idea that having a voter ID would be a barrier or an obstacle is kind of hard to fathom. People get a driver's license, they have a passport because they're flying to Paris, so how hard can it be to have an ID? But there are a lot of people for whom that's a genuine barrier. There's cost to having ID. There's one of our plaintiffs who didn't have a birth certificate. She's an older woman, a black woman who's voted her whole life. Her name was written into the family Bible. That is her birth certificate. And so the hoops you have to go through to acquire a birth certificate from which you can get further ID, it is a genuine barrier. For people who are very poor, for people with disabilities, and based on race, those are genuine barriers. Now, it doesn't have to affect 100% of the electorate for it to have an outcome on the election. Elections can sometimes be won or lost on just a few votes. So if you create a barrier that's going to affect, let's say, 5 or 10% of the electorate, and if half of those people cannot overcome that barrier, you've just lopped off, let's say, 2.5% of the electorate. And that can be the margin by which an election is won or lost. There is an inherent individual level right to vote that's important, but it's also its impact on the election's outcome that is also important. Both of those are in play. The classic thing with this voting fraud argument, though, that I think is the most disturbing is if you as an individual cast your vote, how decisive is your individual vote? Statistic. It's what, like 1 in a, depending on the jurisdiction, it might be like,
I have to say that all votes matter.
all votes matter, right? But if when you cast your vote, it'll have an incremental effect on an election's outcome. You know, as big a champion of voting as I am, it's rare that an election comes down to 1 vote. Sometimes it comes down to like a handful, but very rare. But my point being that when a person commits an act of voter fraud, they bring onto themselves an enormous level of risk. So it's not a rational thing for somebody to go for this incremental potential benefit to the candidate that they're such champion of, to go and take on this giant risk onto themselves. So that's why voter fraud is actually rare. Most people are kind of rational about committing fraud. If they're going to commit fraud, they're going to do it for something that they themselves might have a bigger benefit than the incremental benefit to the candidate.
Well, I'll add just a little bit there. So yeah, you laid it out really well. I think just what I would say is it's very clear that voter fraud doesn't exist. It is very, very rare. And there is a book by a political scientist by the name of Minnick called The Myth of the Voter Fraud, which is really still to this day just the one book that just kind of she's collected all the data, and her work is used often now in many of the voter rights cases around voting ID laws around the country, because so many of those, the first rationale is voter fraud, as you said. So it's very, very rare. There is no evidence for it, and it blows your mind if you think about it, just how often this is held up, again, as the number one reason. And part of this is just public education. People are fearful, right? People who aren't thinking along the lines of wanting to suppress the vote, people who aren't thinking along the lines of racial or ethnic division or denial in terms of representation, but maybe they're genuinely concerned about, they think that their democracy, and oh gosh, and they hear this and they think, does it happen a lot? And it just doesn't. And the other thing I'll add is, let's not make any mistake about it, and I think what you've basically said it, but these voter ID laws are about suppressing the vote. In the North Carolina case, shown that legislative members were seeking data on how it would impact, right, in terms of who has IDs and what groups don't have IDs in the state, and clearly making a connection, right, to if we deny this, it's going to affect certain groups over others. Now, often it's not as explicit as that, or you don't have data nowadays. People are much more careful than they were in the 60s and prior. But we know that that these laws are about targeting certain groups, and so that there's political influence that's affected there. So just to make that really explicit.
Can I just add one more layer to that? When we think about IDs as a form of currency to engage in this practice of voting and this right of voting, talk to us. Let's add the layer of citizenship and immigration. And Mindy, I know that this is part of your research, but can you talk to us a little bit about the voting, how we should think about citizenship and who has access to voting rights in this country, given the population of the United States and that is projecting forward.
Sure, and I'll add one more thing, if I may, just about the voter ID laws. Maybe another way to think about it, I think it's really powerful when you think about young people. So a lot of these ideas these attempts at voter ID laws they aren't about just an ID or a state ID, a driver's license or a state ID, but they get into all kinds of other types of IDs. Is a military ID okay? Is a student ID okay? Right? And many of them deny student IDs. Why do that? Right? Why make it even harder for our young people? I'm on a campus every day, and my students have a lanyard around their neck, and they scan it when they get on the bus, and they scan it as they go around campus. They don't need a driver's license, and many of them don't have driver's license, right? Because they're out of state or from another part of the country, and your freshmen aren't even allowed to have cars, at least on my campus. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. So young people are really disproportionately impacted with voter ID laws, and I think they get lost in that conversation a lot. Young people of color even more so, but young people, period. Citizens. So, well, you talked about it a little bit in terms of the right to vote for folks that are not citizens. So we do have a history in this country prior to the 20th century, or the 1920s or so, where a lot of non-citizens were, I think in about 22 states had the right to vote. So that was taken away as a lot of things were reevaluated at the turn of the century in the 1920s during the Progressive Era. Now, there are some recent, there's some movement afoot. One initiative, really local, if you hadn't heard, in San Francisco, I have to think about it for a second. San Francisco has an initiative that's going to be on the ballot that would allow in school board elections, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think it's full local elections, but it's school board elections, parents or guardians that are non-citizens to be able to vote. And in San Francisco, apparently the public schools alone, I think it's about a third or so of students have a parent that's a non-citizen. So you think about it, that's an awful lot of parents or guardians, right, that can't participate or have a say in their school board. So the idea is to enfranchise them, right, to bring them into the electorate across the country. Over in Maryland, Maryland, I think there's a handful of states, Tahoma Park was one of them, or cities, that has opened it up to local elections for non-citizens. Where else? Chicago has done it for school boards, and I think that's it in the United States. I'm probably missing something. And then internationally, there are lots of countries around the world that allow non-citizens, particularly in the EU, and that kind of might make more sense to you as they've encouraged trade and movement and so forth over the last couple of decades, also allowing some countries, not all, within the EU to non-citizens can vote. So anyway, that's the rundown. I don't know exactly if the question is, but just the thinking around it.
And thinking in terms of the increasing population of the United States of immigrants and how we franchise people, and what's the role of voting rights and citizens. Where does that intersect, and any considerations?
Yeah, well, it's a big question in California because we do have a large segment of our population that are non-citizens, right? Undocumented and non-citizens, period. I think there's a huge, in terms of thinking about what's politically palatable, a lot of folks, the way we think about access to the ballot here in this country, when we think about your right to vote or your privilege to vote, people don't want to give that to folks they don't think are worthy in general, right? So it's all related when you hear a conversation about, well, is somebody educated enough or informed enough, or do we give it to kids? I don't know if I want them making a decision on things that affect my more, we always talk about the worthiness of a vote. And I think when we start talking about folks that aren't citizens and how we think about citizenship in the U.S., people think of that as something that you assimilate and you kind of earn the right. If you become a citizen, you earn the right to vote too, right? And that's like your big reward. So I think if you're asking about political it's palatable and if it will go, I think there is a huge amount of pushback. And just from what I've seen in the press, even in California, but nationally, reactions to what's going on in San Francisco, you see, and even reactions to our automatic voter, automated voter registration bill here in California, when that passed, you saw headlines across the country, and some pretty reputable news outlets that California is going to allow illegal immigrants to vote, because we allow undocumented to have driver's licenses, and it doesn't work that way. So there's a big pushback on that. But I think San Francisco is hoping that they can maybe be a leader nationally because of their size. They're much bigger. Well, Chicago's big too, but they're much bigger than the cities in Maryland. So I mean, I think I'll leave it there if that's helpful and see what you have. Okay.
We're going to pan out a little bit, and when we started this conversation, we talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and what it built in to structures to enable enfranchised voting. Talk to us in the role of states versus federal participation. Talk with us a little bit about where the power, given the dynamics related to voting rights and access and enfranchisement, where should the power lie? With the states, with the federal government, to legislate some of this, to maintain the standards, to hold communities accountable, to create access for citizens to vote?
Well, I'll just start by saying that I think that ultimately a lot of the power does reside in citizens and residents and our associations to protect these rights and make them strong. So just to say that in 1964, in Freedom Summer, there's a lot of black young adults who were out registering to people to vote, but there were also a lot of Jewish students who came from all around the country. And as you all know, 3 of those students from Freedom Summer were killed. In 1965 in Selma, it was the mobilization of the black community, but also the hundreds of religious and faith leaders of all denominations, including Jewish people, who stood side by side with the black community to enact and pass, to fight for the Voting Rights Act. So I would just say, I think in spaces like this, it's really important to emphasize the importance of the people ourselves to stand up for and defend these rights. At every level of jurisdiction, there needs to be protection for voting rights. This fly is flipping between the two of us. The poll worker needs to uphold voting rights. The county registrar of voters needs to uphold voting rights. The secretary of state for the state government needs to uphold voting rights. So we went from having a secretary of state who was issuing the rules that were denying the right to vote to people who should have had the right to vote, who were not in prison and not on parole, to having a secretary of state now, former Senator Padilla, Secretary Padilla, who has taken a number of steps to defend the right to vote. And then you go up to the Justice Department and the federal courts, and they have a right. So I don't think it's an either or. Everyone has a responsibility, from each of us up to the highest court in the land, to uphold this most fundamental, basic element of a democratic society, which is the idea that each of us is equal and each of us has a voice in a government that's representative and that's based on the consent of the governed. And that is not a job that's reserved to just one layer of government, or that we can outsource to just 9 people in black robes. That's a responsibility that we all have and that we're entrusted with protecting. And I would just say also, like in that spirit of alliances, the Jewish community has a long tradition of being an ally in the struggle for civil rights. And there are many organizations locally, at the state level and the federal level, that are wonderful partners and groups to work. In the work we've done to protect the right to vote for people with who've been incarcerated, one of our longest partners is a group called All of Us or None, and it's an association of formerly incarcerated people. The ACLU could not have done what we did were it not for All of Us or None, this tremendous, vibrant group of leaders who are standing up for their right to human dignity. And it's the partnership of organizations like that and others that really makes this work strong and worthwhile. And I think that's within our ability to act, even if the Supreme Court rules against us. That's within our power, and that's within our responsibility to do the things that we can do.
So I wholeheartedly agree with that, of course. Maybe I'll take us in a little bit different direction, just thinking about structure issues. So one thing I neglected to leave out when I was talking about non-citizen voting, the potential of non-citizen voting, is that if you noticed all the examples or local elections, local school boards. So we cannot, at the federal level, have non-citizens vote. So that's a structural issue, right? That's written into our Constitution. So that being said, there are not a whole lot of limits at the federal level. States run their elections, and really counties run their elections. And so in California, we have 58 counties, right? We have, yes, 58 separate elections, basically. All counties have certain rules and requirements. They have to put on an election, they have to make sure it's fair, they don't violate the federal or state rules. But there's a lot of interpretation. And that's not a criticism, that's just a plain fact, and everybody agrees with that. That also, though, leaves us open for violations that happen. Because in our history, when you think about many of the violations, including the one we just mentioned in the last primary, I don't know enough of the details, but what we've heard is this concern about what happened with the Hmong community up in CCEP. At that county level, right, with the discretion that the sheriff had and whatever happened with the registrar, that it allowed for folks to be disenfranchised, right, to be intimidated and disenfranchised. And historically, we've looked across the country and you see a registrar that makes the decision, right, that blocks somebody or denies somebody the right to vote or a group to vote. Because they have that ability to do that. I mean, they don't hopefully legally they used to have that legally, that ability to do that. But even today, they have that discretion, right? They have that, there's not a whole lot of oversight. And so we just understanding that kind of dynamic, how our elections are structured, I think is really, really important. And so that's why, like just recently in Arizona, in their primary, we heard that they had switched to vote centers, people in long lines, people feeling disenfranchised, and literally so, by those lines. And it was a decision made by the registrar, right? And not I don't say manning, that's an old, not putting enough labor power, right? Manning. And not having enough sites, period, and not having enough people there to run them. And people, you know, now across the country, we're looking at, like, how could you possibly think that you had enough staff? Well, maybe it was an innocent mistake. I don't know, we don't know, right? We can only hope that, but still that discretion allowed for disenfranchisement, right? So, so there are limitations. The other thing I mentioned, we have the Election Assistance Commission at the federal level that was established after 2000 and the Bush v. Gore, right? The hanging Chad. And that is an entity that does great work, and they both educate and to some degree help train and kind of monitor what's happening around the country. But again, more limited in what they can actually enforce, right? And it's still a political body with political appointees. And I say that respecting the chair that is there and the intentions of everybody that works there. Elections are political. Running elections is actually political, believe it or not. There's human interpretation and then there's political interpretation. Pressures that happen on registrars right across the country and as they make their decisions, and in our elections as we create our laws and do electoral reforms. The first thing I always hear when there's a new electoral reform, even in our good state here in California, the first question, because I get a lot of media questions, right, my opinion on it or whatever, is what is this going to mean politically? And if you look at who lines up for or against any given reform, it's the folks that, and this could go either way, right? Depends on the election reform maybe, but it's the people that think that they are going, the groups that think that they're going to benefit, the political groups that think they're going to benefit, or the party that thinks it's going to benefit, will say yes, and those that think that this is going to hurt their edge, right, or the voters that it helps are going to be skewed towards the party that's not them, they'll be against it. And so that drives me nuts, because we want to see increased engagement, period. How can this be a political thing? It's a political thing. Of course it is. So that's the biggest part of our structure. Just being aware of that.
Before we go into a question that will lead us into our Q&A. I want to just invite people to send in questions if you have them. If you would like an index card, if you'd like to write down your question, just raise your hand if you don't have an index card and we can pass them around. But this is a great time to start to send in some questions because we're going to move into a question and answer period. The prelude to our Q&A period, I want to just ask a little bit about this upcoming November election. We don't want to talk about candidates so much as we want to talk about the Voting Rights Act.
Goodness, you don't want to talk about candidates.
We don't want to talk about candidates. This is the first election for the presidential race.
I can talk about candidates.
Since we've eliminated some equal protections from the Voter Rights Act, what do you want us to think about and know about and watch for in this election? How can we participate in a meaningful way, to your point, Abdi, to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in voting? What should we think about in terms of voter turnout? Give us some things to think about in terms of the upcoming election.
That's never a good sign when your panelists both turn to each other. Thanks. No. Well, I'll close talking about turnout. What will I open with? Certainly, right, what we always need to do at any given election, right, is to be tracking and vigilant in terms of potential voter suppression. Vote dilution is a longer kind of thing that's around redistricting and other mechanisms, right, to dilute a vote. But voter suppression can pop up anywhere. It can be married and baked into a new law, or it can be somebody rolling out a sign, or rolling out a truck, or intimidating somebody, or whatever, or shutting down a polling site early or something, whatever it might be. So I think on the voter suppression side, certainly always being vigilant at any given election, at any given place. If you want to be a poll worker, you should sign up to be or if you want to be a poll observer, you should be properly trained on that and sign up for that. And we shouldn't be, despite what one major candidate has asked people to do, we shouldn't be going out and randomly being a poll monitor or observe an election. That gets us in a lot of trouble, right? That can lead to voter suppression and intimidation by somebody who's there to be an observer. And even well-intended people can make mistakes, right? And so there's deep training that you need. But you can report things that you hear, your own experiences. I had somebody recently in the primary report something to me in my county, and I called up the registrar and told her what was going on, and it was not suppression, but it was just an informational thing. But you know, that's important, right? Big or small. You know, yes, I think I'll leave it there. I mean, there's organizations that will be doing something much more in depth in terms of, you know, tracking the counties that are supposed to be having materials in certain languages. Are those actually there? Are those that are available? Are they accessible? Are people trained, right, to deal with voters, not to deal with, to properly engage with voters with disabilities? Are there enough, on that topic, are there enough voting accessible machines? Are they turned on? All kinds of things like that, right? Are the sites accessible and available and well signed? And anything that you see, and there are lots of organizations that will be doing this as well. I think switching gears to the election, to me, if we're talking about voice and representation, the dynamics of any given election, right, affect turnout, period. So, like in 2014, when people didn't find it too exciting and didn't, you know, about the governor's race, we didn't have any statewide ballot initiatives that were highly controversial, we didn't have an open Senate seat, right, a lot of things were going on, and that impacted turnout, right? In this election, there's a lot of talk about the race, right? And a lot of heated talk about the race. And we're expecting it to be, even in California, non-swing state, hopefully we'll have good turnout. That'll be the positive, right, from all of the upset and rhetoric that may be mobilizing people. I expect that we will see higher turnout, and I think we'll see higher turnout, particularly from the Latino community, as they're being organized around things like the rhetoric that's being said. A challenge will be going forward. A challenge in the election will be to to make it as accessible, right? So folks that are thinking about, registering, encouraging them to register, thinking about voting, encouraging them to vote. But a challenge also in terms of voice will be after this election. What the heck do we do then? So if we do see higher turnout, how do we get those people, right, to come back into the election? And I think how we handle this election, whatever the outcome is, how it's viewed, how legitimate it's seen to be. So one of the things that's happened recently, and my organization is nonpartisan, but there's been a lot of things in this election, right, that are troubling, period, no matter what side of the aisle you're on or what party. And Donald Trump has talked about, I alluded to the poll workers or observers, but he has stated that if he doesn't win this election, it's because it was rigged, right? Particularly Pennsylvania. That is so dangerous for the long-term health and the immediate health of our democracy. So I'm a political sociologist. One of the things I teach this to students or whatever, and we talk about some of the strengths of a democratic system is you have to have tolerance, right? Willingness to hear other people's ideas and so forth, but you also have to have an easy turn of government where you accept the legitimacy of whoever wins, right? Even if it's not you. Yes, I concede. Right? Ultimately in 2000 we saw that. After a long battle in a court, and went through the courts, Al Gore told us all to count the votes over and over again on live TV. If you remember that. I think he was satire in Saturday Night Live for that. Gotta count the votes. But eventually, right, when this decision came down from the Supreme Court, he also went on live TV, or whatever it was exactly, and said, I will support this, I will support now President Bush. Right? And everybody else should support President Bush. So if there are, I feel like I'm going on a tangent, but it's not. How we handle this election is going to be really important, particularly for underrepresented groups, for everybody, but particularly all the groups that we're talking about tonight, right, in terms of that have been subjected to voting rights and voter suppression. If they view this election, right, if the other way around is illegitimate in some ways, then that can also do tremendous damage and can disenfranchise going forward. So the rhetoric that we use on both sides around the legitimacy of this election, I think is going to be, and yes, that means that some of us might, well, depending on your side, there are going to be people that are going to have to just, suck it up, right? It's going to be hard. I think there's so many deep divisions with this election. But how we handle that, I think it's going to be really, really important. So anyway, for what that's worth.
All right, so there are a bunch of questions that have come from the audience. Thank you. And there are grouped into some different categories. There are a number of questions that are coming from the audience, and they're grouped into a couple of categories. And there are a number of questions that talk about concerns about things like voting machines being hacked, the Secretary of State purging voting rolls to purge people of color from voting rolls, and registrars acting in ways that disenfranchise voting populations and what happens to those votes. And so there's concerns about how to vote, what happens to the technology, who's in charge, and what happens with those votes. Can you just talk a little bit about these concerns that have been expressed and your experience with their validity?
Yes, there's on the voting machines, there's a woman named Barbara Simons who's written a book about the risks to if all voting is done electronically. And I really agree with her concern. There ought to be a paper record for every vote that's cast. And if there's, one silver lining of these stories about the hacking of email accounts and these allegations that the Russians are behind the DNC hack, it's just putting in this idea that, if everything is done through electronics and it's just the computer program and how it's designed or people's ability to go in and mess with the computer program, that can really affect the integrity of the election. So there's a chain from voting through the counting of the votes to the seating of the government that needs to have integrity kind of all the way through that. So, I'm all for the role of technology in democracy. So I support, online voter registration systems, for example, that really make voter registration more accessible. Now, those have to include ensuring access for people with disabilities, for example. But I think when it comes down to the voting machines, just the integrity of the machine is really critical. The other thing too is that there is a movement towards encouraging more absentee ballots and vote by mail. When people vote from home, then they're signing it, it's on a paper ballot. And Oregon's a state that's gone to all vote by mail. My preference is a system that's blended where people have the option to vote by mail or in a polling place. So I only picked up on one of the questions, but I think that's a really valid topic, the question of the integrity of the electoral. It's a different aspect of it. It's not about suppressing a particular group based on race or poverty or disability. It's just the integrity of the overall system. And I think the threat of Russian hackers of our emails and so on certainly got a lot of attention.
So there was so much there, but just to piggyback on technology at least around hacking, there is a difference between hacking or somehow getting access to a voter database, right? The voter roll, registration rolls, and actually hacking an election and changing votes. That's an important distinction. I'll leave it at those two. So when we hear Arizona, for instance, there were two states, and I forgot the other one now in the moment. But recently you might have heard that Arizona and its voter rolls, its database was hacked. That makes people feel fearful about an election being hacked. But there are very different things. And here in California, again, that fragmented, right, except 58 county election system actually helps us if we're fearful of your vote being changed. You have 58 sets of ballots, and by the time they get sent, you get sent and reported on election night, but by the time they actually get certified by the Secretary of State, they've gone through many, many procedures. And so it's very, very, very difficult, in other words, to actually, believe it or not, hack an election and change votes. You may not want the voter rolls, right, which don't have your individual votes on. They just say that you're registered and where you live, and they say that you voted in the last 8 or whatever elections, but that's not where your vote on election night actually goes, right? You can't record that you voted for this person or that person. So you may not want that information out there, but they are two different things. And the protections in our old paper system that are still in place, right, actually give us a lot of protections beyond technology, a lot of layers. So I'll leave it there. There's a report, a story, a lot of stories, but there's one story right now, Capital Weekly, put out today on their website if you're interested about the hacking question. I could talk about online voting, but nobody actually asked that, so I won't, but I can answer that question. I think there were questions in there about
the Secretary of State purging people of color from the voting rolls?
Yeah, and not in California. Somebody else is suggesting. What example were you thinking of? What do you think? Yeah.
I sometimes follow the White Palace to the journalist in the BBC, and I think that someone in the Midwest, I can't remember if it was Oklahoma or Nebraska or somewhere, where the Republican Secretary of State, the excuses that we're getting rid of people who have probably moved, who haven't voted a long time, but basically purging tens of thousands of voters is basically taking people off the voting list.
Yeah. So there's a difference between targeting individuals, right? Which we do have a history of that as well, and then doing purges that are broad and supposedly blind, but the criteria that you use could disproportionately impact some folks. Here in California, so that has historically happened, and I think it's a little more difficult now legally to be able to do that. And there's certainly around that when we had the pre-clearance, that was procedures around purging, I think were things that were subject to that. For instance, in California, we just recently, all of our counties, there's always some degree of purging, usually based on the criteria around time, that it's been a certain amount of time, so we take you off the voting rolls, right? In California, we are developing a new database called VoteCal, because we're the second to the last state in the nation to finally have this database, this technology. That allows us to start implementing a lot of these reforms that I mentioned earlier, like same-day voter registration and 16-year-old, and we just haven't had that technology yet. So we're almost there. This Secretary of State is getting it done, but not quite there, we're almost there. But through that process, many counties had to clean up their voter rolls, not purging in the way that we think about it, but had to clean up their voter rolls. So you may hear about that here in California, that there was a lot of cleaning up. And it actually left us at the beginning, before the primary, like the first of the year, for instance, we were at a lot lower registration, total number of registered folks on the voter rolls, because counties, we started at a lower number than we usually do going into an election season, because counties had been cleaning things up. But it was supposed to be about, and I believe it was about, this new system. Although we certainly heard some folks, say, why was I, and suspicious that there were errors made and that kind of thing. The other thing that I was going to mention, just because usually this comes up, is in this last election, we heard a lot of concerns around the provisional ballots, right? A lot of confusion around because it's a primary, presidential primary, Republicans could only, based on Republican rule, you could only vote in the Republican primary. Democrats were open to independents, but you had to request a Democratic ballot, right? And so there's a lot of confusion about that, particularly because we have such a high number of vote-by-mail folks, meaning you have to request in advance, long in advance. People aren't thinking about it, and so they go down to the polls. They get their ballot, they finally open at the last minute, they realize there's no presidential candidates on this if they're independent, if they're no party preference voter, why aren't there candidates, right? And then they have to figure out that they can go down to the polls, but then they have to surrender their ballot. If they didn't bring it to them, they end up voting provisionally, and so we had about over 700,000, I was tracking all of it around the election, after the election, but over 700,000 provisional ballots in California. But these were because, actually, believe it or not, provisional, the intent is to not disenfranchise, not deny folks. You go to the wrong polling place, you're not on the rolls, you get a provisional. Many people are angry about getting a provisional, and I think they had a case in terms of not feeling like they got the information. What? And the confusion around that. But it is actually part of our system to make sure that people still get their ballot. And the vast majority of provisionals are counted, not everyone, most of the times because you really weren't registered or something. But there was a lot of confusion, and there was a lot of misinformation at the polls, and we get to that. So there were cases, LA Times did a story on this if you want to Google it. I think by John Myers, but I could have that wrong. That just kind of, that talked about around the state and some in LA County where folks were getting misinformation even going to the polls. Because well-intended volunteers in this unusual election cycle, right, didn't have that information. And so people felt like they were being disenfranchised. So that would cause a lot of confusion. And to this day, I think there's a lot of folks who feel like Bernie Sanders, the election was taken from him, and then there's all this confusion about why the heck was there 3 million ballots after election night that had to be counted. Something must have happened. I can explain that if you're interested about why the heck there were 3 million ballots. But a lot of stuff compounding people not trusting what happened. And the bottom line is that people don't trust what happened. If there's real, it's real and its consequences, right? And you have folks now that say, I don't know if I want to vote in some folks, hopefully a very, very small number. But if they feel like they got disenfranchised, they're questioning whether they should vote in the general, or they feel very bad, at least, about the process.
I have to say, I was very thrilled that I got a provisional ballot. I thought,
you were.
I could vote.
Yeah.
I was like, yay, this is wonderful news.
Good, because you were worried you wouldn't get it at all, yeah.
I was worried that I wouldn't be able to vote at all, so it was just fantastic.
Yeah. There's a lot of media that framed provisional ballots. They're not ideal, but that frame them as like a disenfranchisement. Like, you're getting something less than. You're not allowed to vote, but you are voting with the provisional.
Abdi, let me ask you, there's a question that's, I'm thinking about the 2013 case, and since that time, the number of enfranchisement issues that have emerged as a result. Is there enough legal evidence gathering that there might be a chance to do to challenge voting rights and reinstate some of those points of enfranchisement and access?
Well, I think that one of the major issues that I think everyone can agree on, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, is the next president will appoint at least one, if not more, justices of the United States Supreme Court. And the makeup of the Supreme Court will ultimately determine how future voting rights cases are going to be heard and how these statutes are going to be interpreted. This Supreme Court majority has given us some pretty substantial victories. For example, in our work on marriage equality, we had a nice decision in our work on reproductive rights. We've also had some very substantial setbacks, especially in this area of voting rights. So what the next Supreme Court does will certainly point us in different directions. Whether Congress would pass a new Voting Rights Act or not, it's been very difficult to do. But I want to come back to, what is the purpose for why are we here today, and thinking about JCRC and your deliberations about racial justice and how the Jewish community can mobilize its community and its relationships with, in particular, the communities of color and people with disabilities and others. So there's a lot of opportunities, and I think my understanding is that JCRC is a regional organization here in the extended Bay Area, and that you have relationships such that you have a voice in state policy, and you have relationships such that you have a voice in federal policy. And I think you can exercise that voice in every one of those levels. Here at the county level, this is similar to our conversation about criminal justice that we had in Oakland a few months ago. At the county level, the congregations and the Jewish community can be a real force for change. A registrar of voters does not hear from that many stakeholders in the community. And if in each county, JCRC mobilized the Jewish community in partnership with communities of color, with organizations representing people with disabilities, low-income communities, immigrants, immigrants can be citizens. So when I say immigrants, I mean citizens who are not native born and for whom English language proficiency is a barrier. You can make some very substantial progress at the county level. And the model programs that you're able to develop and the solutions that you're able to enact can then become the basis for statewide change or even federal change. In San Diego, we have a pilot project that the ACLU of San Diego is running related to registering people to vote in our county jails. Now, we've worked very hard, and I mean very hard, over a decade in partnership with groups like All of Us or None, and this bill, AB 2466, will hopefully just seal the deal and make it crystal clear that a United States citizen who's held in county jail or who's on probation has the right to vote. Now, what is the rate at which people who are in county jail are registered to vote? It's exceedingly low. What are the practices of our county jail by which people have the opportunity to register or obtain their ballot? They're often non-existent. So that's a place where it would be an incredible act of anti-racism, an incredible act of valor on behalf of all of our communities. It may not be at the level that it was when people went to Mississippi or Alabama, but it is an act in that history to fight for and secure and then to use the right to vote in every nook and cranny of our community where we have it. So I think that there's some very practical things that JCRC can do at the county level. There's a lot you can do at the state level, and there's a lot you can do with the wider Jewish community and the wider alliance of civil rights groups at the federal level as well.
I'm going to give you both about 2.5 minutes to do some closing thoughts. It's been a jam-packed 90 minutes, and I know there's a lot more to talk about. We've barely scratched the surface. But give us your best 2.5 minutes of what else you want to leave us with, and then we're going to go into a voting process together. So, whoever would like to start.
Your call, who goes first?
Well, again, I'll echo everything you said. I mean, and I was, I think, trying to gently allude to it earlier, too, in the sense that voting rights are very important. Voter suppression, vote dilution is something that we need to always have our eye on the ball, right? And monitoring, tracking, and fighting against. At the same time, though, we're talking about voice, we're talking about representation in our political system and how that equates with change and outcomes and policy. The very big bang for your buck, right, is to be working on turnout, education, and outreach, which is what you're talking about. So we need both, but in terms of sheer numbers. And groups that are historically underrepresented are information low and have a lot of systemic barriers to why they don't participate. But they are also very impacted positively by outreach. And it can't be like the door, put something on the door hanger kind of a thing. It has to be deeper, what I call deep outreach. You talk to young people, peer-to-peer is always more effective, people of the same background. But whatever you do, right, talking and connecting why voting is important, why it matters to them, their communities, issues they care about. Because there's, like for young people, many young people that are engaged in their communities, that are informed, that care about issues or whatever. But when you look and talk to them, you find out they don't vote. And you go, why don't you vote? Because you think, how in the world can voting be an actionable step on something I care about? I'm better off, working, right, in a foreign organization and things like that. So talking to folks and connecting why it's important and tapping it and making it personal in that way can be really, really effective. The other thing I'll mention, not to get into the weeds, but there are, as I mentioned, a lot of the electoral reforms that have happened recently. Getting educated about those, there's so much misinformation about what our automated voter registration law means. I've heard groups, seasoned organizers, that'll tell me, oh, we've got automatic voter registration in California, right? It's all going to be done at the DMV, everybody's going to be registered. I don't have to worry about registration anymore, I can focus on getting out the vote. Well, even with full automatic voter registration, not everybody that's automatically voted is going to be, or registered is going to become an automatic voter. But the law doesn't do everything that we want it to do. It's not as complete. It's a great step forward. Same-day voter registration is really not same-day voter registration. It's conditional voter registration in California, another example. So you can only get same-day registered at select places, not at every polling place. So if you really want to, work in this area, getting ahead of all of these reforms and getting educated about them, so you spread correct information, but also you can strategize around them. We may be, on the governor's desk right now is a bill called SB 450, looking at vote centers. That means that we would replace neighborhood polling places for every county that opts in, replace neighborhood polling places with vote centers, which are open longer, but they're less numerous. They have some additional services for voters, and all that sort of, and I can talk more about this if you're interested. But it would be a significant change to our system. And so understanding if that's going to happen, what that's going to look like, how do you engage populations that might not be as receptive. We've done research to find out that some groups, particularly Latinos, LAP voters, African American voters, are at least initially right now, the concept of a vote center, they have a lot of concerns around. So some voters see it very positively also. But understanding these changes, if they come, getting educated about them and understanding how even very positive electoral reforms, like online voter registration, how could that be bad, right, can have unintended consequences, right, to create disparity. And it largely hasn't, it's been great, but no reform exactly evenly collects, impacts everyone. So those would be areas to target. New reform, where are the folks that might be not so positively impacted by this, that we can educate and outreach to and make this a positive reform. Make sense? Those are some of my recommendations. That wasn't 2.5 minutes. Very kind.
Get another comment or question?
We'd like you to do a close and then we're going to do some polling.
Oh, okay.
You're on for the close.
Yeah, I think I kind of did my close a moment ago. I think the main point would be, for JCRC, as you're thinking through all of the different pieces of the racial justice program, the voting piece is a critical one, and it also has a lot of intersections with other aspects of social justice. So if you pursue a path related to, say, to criminal justice reform, well, each of the county sheriffs in your region is the person responsible ultimately in partnership with the registrar of voters to enact, to implement voting in the county jails. So that's something that would be kind of a 2-for-1, where if you're going to reach out to the sheriff on some criminal justice reforms, you can also talk to the sheriff about voting. And I would just say, if this community were persistent enough, it would have a transformational impact on the ability of people in our county jails to vote. If you're persistent at that, when we're back together again 4 years from now, we'll look back and say, in partnership with this constellation of organizations, we can see that people meaningfully exercise the right to vote in our county jails. That's the kind of change you can make. Now, what happens with the United States Supreme Court might be a little less within our control. But there are some things that are closer to our sphere of influence. And I think by taking those actions, it can make a mark for the rest of the country as well.
Can I have just one technical thing? Sorry. Really quick. I was saying about outreach and education and all of that, but of course, you should be outreaching and educating, speaking of policy, talking to your registrar's office, right, about all of these reforms, and having input in how they get implemented, how the registrar interacts with groups in their outreach and education. There's a lot of local policy work and events that you can do there.
Thank you. I want to just have us all thank Abdi and for this. Something that Abdi just said, the idea that we could look back in 4 years and feel like we have accomplished something important and participated as real partners in our community with other communities, other faith groups, other people with other experiences, to do something that really matters, and we might look back and have actually affected change. Felt like a big breath that washed over me, and so I just wanted us to hold that possibility that we might look back and do something really important for ourselves, our community, and really all of our citizens of the community. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Trulich, and I want to thank our panelists and ask you to step down so that we're going to bring the screen back down.